The Velthari, cruiser called Ascending Dawn, had been watching Earth for almost 3 months before Commander Felvax decided it was time to make contact with the primitive species below. And his crew had spent countless hours studying the strange blue planet that orbited a single yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The Velthari were a proud reptilian species known throughout the Galactic Federation for their scientific achievements and their careful approach to studying less advanced worlds. And they had cataloged over 2,000 primitive civilizations in their long history as explorers. Their scales shifted between green and purple depending on their mood, and they stood nearly 7 feet tall with powerful tails and claws that could cut through metal. But despite their fearsome appearance, they considered themselves scholars first and warriors second. Felvax stood on the bridge of his ship and looked down at the planet spinning slowly beneath them, and he felt confident that this mission would be simple and straightforward like all the others before it. The humans appeared to be a fragile species with soft skin and no natural weapons, and their technology was primitive compared to the Velthari, who had mastered faster-than-light travel centuries ago. Science Officer Krelnath approached the commander with her datapad in hand and her crest raised in a gesture of professional respect. "Commander, I have completed the preliminary analysis of the human species," she said, in the clicking language of their people. "They are remarkably weak by galactic standards, and their planet is divided into hundreds of separate territories that they call countries." Felvax made a sound of amusement deep in his throat and replied, "A divided species is always easier to study, and their internal conflicts suggest they pose no threat to anyone but themselves." Security Chief Vortek joined them on the bridge and added his own observations to the discussion, noting that human weapons were crude and their space exploration had barely reached their own moon. "I recommend we acquire a specimen for study," Krelnath suggested. "A single human would provide us with all the biological and psychological data we need to complete our report for the Federation Council." The commander agreed and ordered his crew to find a suitable target, someone isolated who would not be missed immediately and who appeared to represent an average member of their species. Their scanners detected a lone figure sitting outside one of the residential buildings, and the human appeared to be drinking something from a metal container, while a small, furry creature sat beside him. "That one," Felvax decided, pointing at the holographic display. "He is alone, and the hour is late, so his disappearance will not be noticed until morning." What the Velthari scanners failed to detect was that this particular human was not American at all, despite being at an American university, and his name was Danny Cooper, from a small town about 2 hours outside of Brisbane, in the land the humans called Australia. Danny was 22 years old and had come to America on an exchange program to study engineering. But right now he was simply enjoying a quiet beer and the company of a stray cat that had adopted him during his first week on campus. He was thinking about the spider he had found in his room earlier that evening, a small brown thing that would have been harmless back home, but had caused his American roommate to scream like he was being murdered. Danny had simply picked it up and put it outside while his roommate watched in horror, and he was now wondering if he should call his mum to tell her about how soft these Americans were when it came to wildlife. The night air was cool and pleasant, and Danny was enjoying the silence when he noticed a strange blue light beginning to form around him, and he looked up to see something large and metallic hovering silently above the campus. "Well, that's different," Danny said to the cat, who meowed in response and showed no particular concern about the spacecraft that had appeared overhead. The blue light grew brighter, and Danny felt his body becoming lighter as some invisible force began to lift him off the bench, and he watched with mild curiosity as the ground fell away beneath his feet. His beer remained firmly in his grip because a true Australian never let go of his drink no matter what the circumstances, and Danny found himself floating upward through the night sky toward what was clearly an alien vessel of some kind. The cat watched him go with the bored expression that cats everywhere seem to share. And then it wandered off to find someone else to sit with, since its current companion had apparently been selected for some kind of cosmic adventure. Danny passed through the hull of the ship without feeling anything, and materialized in a room with silver walls and strange humming machines. And standing before him were three of the ugliest creatures he had ever seen. They were tall and covered in scales that shifted colors as they moved, and their yellow eyes had vertical pupils like a crocodile, and their mouths were filled with small sharp teeth that glistened under the artificial lights. Danny looked at them, and they looked at him, and there was a moment of silence as both parties tried to figure out what to make of the other. The human took a sip of his beer, which had somehow survived the teleportation process completely intact. And then he smiled at the aliens in a friendly way. "Good day," he said in the casual tone that Australians used, whether they were greeting a friend or apparently meeting extraterrestrial life for the first time. The aliens exchanged glances with each other, and their crests moved in ways that suggested confusion. And one of them pressed something on a device attached to its wrist. "Human," a mechanical voice translated the alien's clicking speech. "You have been taken for study, and you will follow all instructions, and resistance will result in consequences." Danny considered this statement for a moment while finishing the last of his beer, and he looked around the room at the medical equipment and the table with restraints that was obviously meant for him. He thought about his options, and decided that he was not particularly interested in being experimented on by a bunch of oversized lizards, no matter how advanced their technology might be. "Yeah, nah," Danny replied with a shrug. "I don't reckon that's gonna work for me, mate, but thanks for the offer." The aliens stared at him with what might have been disbelief, though it was hard to read expressions on faces that were so different from human features, and the one who seemed to be in charge made a hissing sound. "The translator may be malfunctioning," one of them suggested. "The human does not appear to understand the seriousness of the situation." Danny crushed his empty beer can and looked around for a bin to throw it in, and when he found nothing suitable, he simply held on to it, because littering was wrong, even on an alien spaceship. He had dealt with scarier things than these aliens back home, like the time a brown snake had gotten into his grandmother's kitchen, or the morning he had woken up to find a huntsman spider the size of his hand sitting on his face. These scaly blokes were tall and had sharp claws, but Danny had grown up in a country where everything was trying to kill you from the moment you were born, and he was not about to be intimidated by some space lizards who probably had never even seen a saltwater crocodile. "So what happens now then?" Danny asked in a conversational tone. "Because I've got an assignment due next week, and I really should be getting back to work on that." The Velthari had abducted many species over their long history as explorers, but they had never encountered anything quite like this strange, calm human, who seemed to view his own kidnapping as a minor inconvenience, rather than a terrifying ordeal. Commander Thelvax felt the first small stirring of uncertainty in his chest, though he dismissed it quickly as irrelevant, and he ordered his crew to begin the examination procedures, while the human was still being cooperative. Moment, and recognize it as the beginning of the worst mission of his entire career. The medical bay of the Ascending Dawn was equipped with the most advanced technology the Velthari had developed over centuries of scientific research, and the walls were lined with devices that could scan every cell in a living body within seconds. Commander Thelvax stood with his arms crossed and his crest raised high in a display of authority as his crew prepared to examine their human specimen, and he was confident that this process would be quick and efficient. Science Officer Krelnath activated the scanning equipment and directed Danny to stand in the center of a glowing circle on the floor, and the human complied without complaint while still holding his crushed beer can. "The scanning process will map your entire biological structure," Krelnath explained through the translator. "You may experience some discomfort, but the procedure is not harmful." Danny stood still and watched the blue lights pass over his body, and he thought that this was actually Pretty interesting compared to the medical checkups he got back home, where they just stuck a thermometer in your mouth and called it a day. The results of the scan appeared on multiple displays around the room, and Krelnath studied them with growing fascination as she discovered just how strange human biology really was. "Remarkable," she muttered while scrolling through the data. "The human cardiovascular system is incredibly inefficient compared to our own, and their respiratory system can only extract a small percentage of oxygen from the air." Vortek looked at the displays and added his own observations, noting that human bones were relatively fragile, and their skin provided almost no protection against claws or teeth. They have no venom glands, no natural armor, and their physical strength is mediocre at best, the security chief concluded. "I do not understand how this species became dominant on their planet." Mild amusement and decided to offer some context that might help them understand. "We're pretty good at making things," he said casually. "Give a human a rock and a stick, and eventually they'll figure out how to kill a mammoth with it." The translator struggled with the word mammoth, but eventually found an equivalent in the Velthari language, and Krelnath made a note about human tool use in her report. "Your medical history is concerning," she said, after reviewing more of the scan data. "You have sustained numerous injuries throughout your short life, including broken bones, burn damage, and what appears to be toxic exposure on multiple occasions." "Oh yeah, that would be the snake bites," Danny explained. "Got tagged by a brown snake when I was 15, and a red-belly black snake a few years later. But neither of them were too bad because I got the antivenom pretty quick." Vortek immediately began searching his database for information on these creatures, and his scales turned a pale shade of gray as he read about the brown snake and its reputation as one of the most venomous land snakes on Earth. "Commander," the security chief said in a voice that wavered slightly, "the brown snake that the human mentioned carries enough venom to kill over 20 adult Velthari with a single bite, and this human claims to have survived 2 separate encounters with similar creatures." Felvax turned to look at their human specimen with new interest, and for the first time he noticed that the creature seemed completely relaxed despite being held captive by an alien species. "Are such dangerous creatures common in your territory?" the commander asked through the translator. Danny laughed and shook his head, as if the question was silly, and he began to explain what life was like in the land called Australia. "Mate, everything in Australia is trying to kill you from the moment you're born," Danny said with a grin. "Snakes, spiders, crocodiles, jellyfish, sharks, stingrays, and about a dozen other things that can end you before you even know what happened." He then launched into a detailed description of the box jellyfish, a creature that looked like a floating plastic bag, but carried enough venom to stop a human heart within minutes, and he explained how Australians learned from childhood to watch for them during swimming season. Krelnath took careful notes while Danny talked about the various hazards of his homeland, and she found herself becoming increasingly disturbed by what she was hearing. The humans spoke about these deadly creatures the way a Velthari might speak about mild weather or a pleasant meal, as if constant mortal danger was simply a normal part of everyday life. "There was this one time," Danny continued, warming to his subject, "when my uncle was fishing up near Darwin, and a saltwater croc came right up on the bank where he was sitting. Been 4 meters long at least." "What did your uncle do?" Vortek asked, despite himself, his scales still pale from the earlier revelations. "He threw his cooler at it and ran," Danny said with a shrug. "Lost all his beer, but kept his legs, so it was a fair trade, really." The Velthari exchanged glances with each other, and Felvax felt that small seed of uncertainty in his chest begin to grow into something larger and more uncomfortable. They had expected to find a simple, primitive creature that would cower in fear and provide easy data for their research, but instead they had captured something that seemed to view death as a minor inconvenience. "Tell me more about these spiders," Krelnath requested, her scientific curiosity overcoming her growing unease. Danny was happy to explain about the Sydney funnel web spider, a creature with fangs strong enough to pierce a fingernail, and venom that attacked the human nervous system with brutal efficiency. PhD, he talked about the redback spider that liked to hide in outdoor toilets and had sent many Australians to the hospital over the years. And he mentioned the huntsman spiders that were mostly harmless, but grew to the size of dinner plates and enjoyed living inside houses. "We had one in my bedroom for about 6 months, Danny recalled fondly. Called him Barry, and he kept the mosquitoes under control. But my mom eventually made me put him outside because he scared the neighbors." Vortek had stopped taking notes and was now simply staring at the human with an expression that looked very much like horror, and his tail had curled protectively around his legs. "You willingly cohabitated with a venomous creature?" the security chief asked in disbelief. "Huntsmen aren't venomous enough to hurt people," Danny corrected him. "Well, not seriously anyway, and Barry was a good spider who minded his own business." Felvax decided that they had spent enough time on this line of discussion, and ordered his crew to move on to the psychological evaluation portion of the examination. The psychological tests were designed to establish baseline fear responses by showing the subject images of various threatening creatures and situations. And the Veltari had developed this method over centuries of studying primitive species. Krelnath activated the holographic display and began showing Danny images of the most fearsome predators in the known galaxy, creatures with multiple rows of teeth and poison-tipped tails, and armored bodies that could shrug off most weapons. Danny studied each image with polite interest, and occasionally asked questions about the creatures, but his vital signs never showed any increase in stress or fear response. "That one looks like a drop bear," he commented when shown an image of a Kralthian deathstalker. "We've got something similar back home, but they're smaller, and they drop out of trees onto your head." A P. The Velthari could not determine if drop bears were real creatures or some kind of human joke, but given everything else they had learned about Australia, they were not willing to dismiss the possibility. After 3 hours of testing, they had established that Danny's fear response was either broken or had been calibrated to threats so extreme that nothing the Velthari could show him even registered as dangerous. "The human appears to be psychologically abnormal," Krelnath concluded in the report. "Further study is required to determine if this is a common trait among the Australian subspecies." Danny yawned and asked if there was somewhere he could get some sleep because all this talking had made him tired, and the Velthari assigned him to a small holding cell while they tried to figure out what to do with their unexpectedly complicated specimen. The commander retired to his quarters that night, feeling troubled in ways he could not quite articulate. He dreamed of a planet filled with venomous creatures and humans who laughed in the face of death. The second day of Danny's captivity aboard the Velthari vessel began with what the aliens called a nutritional assessment, which meant they wanted to know what humans ate and how their digestive systems worked. Danny woke up in his small holding cell, feeling surprisingly well rested despite the circumstances, and he stretched his arms above his head and wondered if the aliens had anything decent for breakfast. The cell was comfortable enough, with a sleeping platform that molded itself to his body, and a small facility in the corner that he had figured out was their version of a toilet. And the temperature was a bit cool, but nothing compared to a winter morning in the outback. 2 guards came to collect him, and escorted him back to the medical bay, where Science Officer Krelnath was waiting, with more questions and more scanning equipment. "We wish to understand your nutritional requirements," she explained through the translator. "Humans consume a wide variety of organic matter, but we lack specific details about your preferences." Danny considered this question, and decided to be helpful, since these aliens had been relatively polite so far, despite the whole kidnapping situation. "I could go for some bacon and eggs right now," he admitted. "Maybe some toast with Vegemite, if you've got any, but I'm guessing that might be hard to find up here in space." The translator struggled with several of these terms, and Krelnath had to request clarification on what bacon and Vegemite actually were. Danny explained that bacon was thin slices of meat from a pig that were fried until crispy, and Vegemite was a dark brown paste made from yeast extract that Australians spread on bread. "Your species consumes the flesh of other animals?" Vortek asked with what sounded like surprise, having just arrived in the medical bay for his shift. "Yeah, mate, humans are omnivores," Danny confirmed. "Pretty much anything that doesn't eat us first, and sometimes things that try to eat us too." This statement required further explanation, and Danny found himself describing the Australian tradition of eating crocodile meat and kangaroo steaks, which he admitted were actually quite tasty when prepared properly. The Velthari had apparently expected humans to be herbivores based on their flat teeth and small mouths, and learning that this supposedly primitive species actively hunted and consumed dangerous predators added another layer to their growing concern. Krelnath made extensive notes about human dietary habits, and then moved on to discussing the social structures of Danny's homeland, hoping to gain some insight into how Australian humans organize their communities. "So you live in family groups?" she asked. "Our scans indicated that humans form pair bonds and raise offspring together." Danny nodded and talked about his own family back in Queensland, describing his parents and his younger sister and his various uncles and aunts and cousins who were scattered across the eastern coast of Australia. He spoke warmly about his grandmother, who made the best meat pies in the southern hemisphere, and he mentioned his grandfather, who had fought crocodiles during his younger days and still had the scars to prove it. "Your elderly family members engaged in combat with large predators?" Vortek interrupted, his scales once again turning that pale shade that indicated distress. "Only when he had to," Danny said with a shrug. "Grandpa worked on cattle stations up north, and the crocs would sometimes come after the livestock, so someone had to deal with them." The security chief made a small sound of dismay and excused himself from the room, claiming he needed to check on something in the armory. Krelnath continued the interview alone, and asked Danny about Australian customs and traditions, hoping to find something normal and predictable about this strange subspecies of human. Danny talked about barbecues and beach trips and the proper way to celebrate Christmas and summer, and he explained the sacred ritual of Sunday morning sports and the importance of a good meat pie at the football. But then he mentioned something called swooping season, and Krelnath found herself once again confronting the casual violence of Australian life. "Every year around springtime, the magpies start nesting," Danny explained, "and they get real protective of their territory, so they attack anyone who walks too close to their trees." "The birds attack humans?" Krelnath asked for clarification. "Oh yeah, they go straight for your eyes," Danny confirmed. "Everyone learns real quick to wear sunglasses during swooping season, and some people put cable ties on their helmets to confuse the birds." He went on to describe how Australian children were taught from a young age to recognize the warning calls of aggressive magpies, and how entire streets would become no-go zones during the breeding season. "But they're pretty smart birds," Danny added thoughtfully. "They remember faces, so if you're nice to them, they'll leave you alone, but if you upset one, it'll hold a grudge forever." Krelnath had to stop the interview for a moment to process what she had just heard, and she found herself wondering what kind of planet produced intelligent, vengeful birds that attacked the dominant species on a seasonal basis. The afternoon brought more revelations, as Danny casually mentioned other aspects of Australian life that the Velthari found deeply disturbing. He talked about the Great Emu War, a real historical event where the Australian military had deployed soldiers with machine guns against a population of large flightless birds, and had essentially lost the conflict. He described the phenomenon of kangaroos that would drown dogs in water as a defensive strategy. And he mentioned the platypus, a creature so bizarre that early European scientists had thought it was a hoax. "It's got a duckbill and beaver tail, and it lays eggs, but it's also a mammal," Danny explained, and the males have venomous spurs on their back legs that can cause pain for months if they get you. A venomous mammal, Krelnath repeated slowly, her translator rendering her disbelief into flat mechanical tones. Yeah, weird, right? Danny agreed, but they're cute, so everyone loves them. By the end of the second day, the Velthari crew had begun avoiding Danny whenever possible, and those who had to interact with him did so with visible nervousness. The ship's artificial intelligence had flagged Danny's conversations as a potential psychological hazard, and recommended that exposure to the human be limited to essential personnel only. Commander Felvax received a report that evening indicating crew morale had dropped significantly since the human's arrival, and 3 crew members had requested transfers to other vessels, citing stress-related concerns. "What is happening to my ship?" the commander demanded during a senior staff meeting. "We have studied hundreds of primitive species without any problems, but this single human is causing chaos." Krelnath hesitated before responding, and then admitted that she had also been experiencing unusual anxiety since beginning her work with the human specimen. "Commander, I believe we have made a significant error in judgment," she said carefully. "This human comes from a region of his planet that appears to be uniquely hostile to life, and the inhabitants have adapted in ways our models did not predict." Vortek agreed, and added that he had been having nightmares about box jellyfish and funnel web spiders, creatures he had never seen but could now picture vividly thanks to Danny's descriptions. "The human does not seem to realize the effect he is having on us," the security chief observed. "He speaks of these horrors as if they are perfectly normal, which suggests that he is either mentally damaged or his entire population has been desensitized to constant mortal danger." Felvax considered this information and realized that returning the human to his planet was becoming an increasingly attractive option, but doing so would mean abandoning their mission and admitting defeat. His pride as a Velthari commander would not allow such an outcome, at least not yet, and he ordered his crew to continue their research while taking precautions to protect their mental health. "We will complete this mission," he declared firmly. "We are Velthari scientists, and we will not be defeated by the stories of a primitive mammal." But even as he spoke these words, the commander felt doubt growing in his hearts, and he wondered what other surprises this strange human had in store for them. Danny, meanwhile, had settled into his cell for another night of sleep, and was dreaming peacefully about his grandmother's meat pies and the beach back home, where the waves were always perfect for surfing. He had no idea that his simple, honest descriptions of Australian life were causing a crew of advanced aliens to question everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. The third day aboard the Ascending Dawn began like the others, with guards escorting Danny from his cell to the medical bay. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the ship, and Danny could sense it, even without understanding alien body language. The crew members he passed in the corridors moved away from him, as if he carried some kind of disease, and their scales flickered through nervous patterns of color that even Danny could recognize as fear. He found this slightly amusing, since he had not done anything threatening during his time as their guest, but he supposed that all his talk about Australian wildlife might have made an impression. Science Officer Krelnath was waiting for him as usual, but she looked tired, and her crest was drooping in a way that suggested she had not slept well. "We have more questions today," she said through the translator. "The Federation Council requires detailed information about human military capabilities before we can complete our assessment of your species." Danny sat down on the examination platform and made himself comfortable while Krelnath prepared her recording equipment. "I'm not really a military bloke," Danny admitted. "I'm just an engineering student, but I know some stuff from history class if that helps." Krelnath assured him that any information would be valuable, and asked him to describe how humans conducted warfare. Danny thought about this question for a moment, and then began explaining the various conflicts that had shaped human history, starting with ancient battles fought with swords and spears, and moving up through the development of guns and tanks and aircraft. He talked about the world wars that had killed millions of humans and reshaped the political boundaries of his planet. And he described the nuclear weapons that now sat in bunkers around the world, capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. The Velthari listened with growing horror. Danny casually explained the concept of mutually assured destruction, a doctrine that relied on the threat of total annihilation to prevent major wars between powerful nations. So, your species developed weapons capable of ending all life on your planet, Vortex summarized slowly. And then you decided to keep those weapons ready for use at all times. Pretty much, yeah, Danny confirmed. It's called deterrence, the idea being that nobody will start a nuclear war if they know the other side will just nuke them back. This is insane, Vortex muttered in his own language before the translator could catch it. Danny shrugged and pointed out that it had worked so far, since no nuclear weapons had been used in combat since the Second World War, though he admitted that the situation was not exactly stable. Krelnath steered the conversation toward more conventional military matters, and asked about the fighting capabilities of individual human soldiers. Led Danny to talk about the Australian military and some of the famous battles they had participated in throughout history, including the landing at Gallipoli and the fighting in the jungles of Vietnam and the more recent operations in the Middle East. He spoke with obvious pride about the toughness of Australian soldiers and their reputation for being able to survive in harsh environments that would break troops from other countries. We've got this thing called the SAS, Danny explained, Special Air Service Regiment, and those blokes are absolutely mental in the best possible way. They can survive in the desert for weeks with almost no supplies, and they're trained to kill in about 50 different ways. Vortex had begun pacing nervously around the room while Danny talked, and his tail was twitching in patterns that indicated extreme agitation. And regular civilians, the security chief interrupted. What kind of combat training do they receive? Laughed at this question and said that most Australians were not trained fighters. But then he thought about it more carefully and reconsidered his answer. Well, we all learned to swim pretty young because of the beaches, he said, and most people know basic first aid because you never know when someone's going to get bitten by something, and I guess growing up in the bush teaches you how to survive without much help. He mentioned that many Australians owned firearms for hunting and pest control, and that shooting was a common hobby in rural areas where kangaroos and wild pigs could destroy crops and livestock. My uncle taught me to shoot when I was 12, Danny recalled. We used to go out after feral pigs on his property because they tear up the land something terrible if you let them breed. The Velthari exchanged worried glances, and Krelnath made a note that Australian humans were apparently trained in wilderness survival and weapons use from childhood as a matter of routine. By midday, Danny had grown bored with the endless questions and began to feel restless in a way that reminded him of being stuck inside during a rainy weekend back home. He had been cooperative because he was curious about the aliens and their technology. But 3 days was long enough, and he was starting to miss things like sunshine and fresh air and proper food. Look, Danny said during a pause in the questioning, this has been interesting and all, but I really should be getting back now. I've got an assignment due, and my roommate is probably wondering where I've gone. Commander Thelvax had arrived in the medical bay partway through the morning and was observing the proceedings from a corner of the room. That is not possible, the commander said firmly. You are a research subject, and you will remain aboard this vessel until our study is complete. Danny looked at the tall alien, with his shifting scales and sharp claws, and considered his options for a moment. He thought about his grandmother, who had once fought off a brown snake with a garden rake, and his uncle, who had wrestled a crocodile to save his dog, and his father, who had driven through a bushfire to get home to his family. Australians did not give up easily, and they certainly did not let a bunch of oversized lizards tell them what to do. Yeah, nah, Danny said, in a tone that was still friendly, but carried a new edge of determination. "I reckon I'll be leaving now." The guards in the room moved to block the door, but Danny did not head for the door. Instead, he looked up at the ceiling where a ventilation grate was clearly visible. In one smooth motion, he jumped onto the examination platform and then leaped for the grate, catching the edge with his fingers and pulling himself up with the strength that came from years of surfing and swimming. The Velthari stood frozen in shock for a critical few seconds as the human disappeared into the ventilation shaft, and by the time they reacted, Danny was already crawling through the narrow metal tunnels that ran throughout the ship. Alarms began blaring throughout the ascending dawn as the crew realized their specimen had escaped, and Commander Thelvax shouted orders for security teams to seal all exits and search every compartment. But Danny had spent his childhood exploring caves and abandoned mines around his hometown, and navigating through dark, cramped spaces was something he had been doing since before he could drive. The ventilation system was tight, but not impossible, and Danny moved through it with the calm confidence of someone who had once crawled through a pipe full of spiders to retrieve a cricket ball. He could hear the Velthari searching for him in the corridors below, their clawed feet clicking against the metal floors, and their voices making urgent clicking sounds that the translator could not reach. Moving, and tried to remember the layout of the ship from his walks between the cell and the medical bay, and he figured the shuttle bay had to be somewhere near the outer edge of the vessel. He encountered several obstacles along the way, including a section of pipe that was filled with some kind of cooling fluid, but he pushed through it without hesitation and emerged on the other side, soaking wet and slightly blue. "This is nothing compared to that time I swam through the flooded mine shaft," Danny muttered to himself as he continued his journey through the alien ship. The Velthari had not designed their ventilation system with escaped prisoners in mind, because no species in their experience had ever been crazy enough to crawl through the maintenance ducts of a starship. The tunnels were filled with electrical conduits that sparked occasionally, and pipes carrying fluids at various temperatures, and most creatures would have turned back at the first sign of danger. Danny pushed forward because Australians had learned long ago that hesitation in dangerous situations usually made things worse, and the only way out was through. After what felt like an hour of crawling, he found a grate that overlooked a large open space filled with small spacecraft, and he knew he had found the shuttle bay. The room was not empty, because a single Velthari technician was working on one of the vessels, running diagnostic checks and making notes on a datapad. Danny considered his options and decided that surprise was his best weapon, so he kicked out the grate and dropped to the floor behind the startled alien. "G'day, mate," Danny said cheerfully as the technician spun around with wide eyes. "Don't suppose you could show me how to fly one of these things?" The technician made a sound that might have been a scream and fled from the shuttle bay, leaving Danny alone with several spacecraft and no idea how to operate any of them. But Danny had grown up helping his father fix tractors and cars and various other machines, and he figured that technology was technology regardless of who had built it. He climbed into the nearest vessel and started pressing buttons, until something happened. The escape pod lurched violently as Danny pressed what he hoped was the launch button, and he was thrown back into the pilot's seat as the small vessel shot out of the shuttle bay and into the darkness of space. Behind him, the ascending dawn grew smaller in the viewport, as the automated systems of the escape pod calculated a trajectory toward the blue planet spinning below. Danny did not know how to actually fly the craft, but the Velthari had apparently designed their escape pods to be foolproof, and the computer was handling most of the work, while he held on and tried not to throw up. The pod shook and rattled as it entered Earth's atmosphere, and Danny watched through the small window as flames licked around the edges of the hull from the friction of re-entry. He had experienced some rough situations in his life, including a car accident on a wet road and a particularly bad wipeout while surfing, but plummeting toward Earth in an alien spacecraft was definitely a new level of turmoil. "She'll be right," Danny told himself as the pod continued its violent descent. Worse things happen at sea. The Valthari escape pod was designed to protect its occupant during emergency landings, and the craft deployed a series of parachutes and anti-gravity systems that slowed its fall as it dropped through the clouds. Danny looked out the window and saw flat brown land stretching to the horizon, which did not look like the green campus he had left behind 3 days ago. The pod hit the ground hard and skidded across a wheat field, leaving a long furrow in the dirt, before finally coming to a stop against a wooden fence post. Danny sat still for a moment to make sure he was still alive, and then he unfastened the harness that had kept him in his seat and pushed open the pod's hatch. The air that rushed in was cool and dry and smelled like earth and growing things, and Danny climbed out of the alien vessel and stood in the middle of a Kansas wheat field as the sun began to set over the plains. He looked back at the smoking escape pod and shook his head at the strangeness of the past 3 days, and then he started walking toward the road he could see in the distance. A pickup truck appeared about 20 minutes later, driven by a farmer named Pete, who was on his way back from checking on his livestock. Pete stopped when he saw the young man walking along the shoulder of the road, covered in blue fluid and what looked like scorch marks, and he rolled down his window to offer help. "You all right there, son?" Pete asked in the slow drawl of the American Midwest. "Yeah, mate, I'm fine," Danny replied. "Just had a bit of an interesting night. Any chance you could give me a lift to the nearest town?" Pete looked at the strange young man, and then looked back at the column of smoke rising from his wheat field, and he decided that some questions were better left unasked. Danny climbed into the truck without further explanation. The farmer drove Danny to the nearest town and dropped him at a bus station, and Danny used a payphone to call his university and explain that he had been gone for a few days due to unexpected circumstances. His roommate was relieved to hear from him and said that campus security had been looking for him after he disappeared, but Danny told him not to worry and that he would be back as soon as he could find transportation. It took 2 days for Danny to make his way back to Greenfield State University, traveling by bus and catching rides with friendly strangers who asked no questions about his unusual appearance or vague explanations. He arrived back at his dormitory on a Thursday afternoon and found his roommate studying at his desk, and the American student jumped up with surprise when Danny walked through the door. "Dude, where have you been?" the roommate demanded. "Everyone thought you got kidnapped. Or something." Danny considered telling the truth, but decided that nobody would believe him anyway, so he simply said he had gotten lost during a walk and ended up having an adventure. He never mentioned the aliens to anyone except his family back in Australia, and even they thought he was joking when he told the story during a video call. Meanwhile, aboard the Ascending Dawn, Commander Thelvax was facing the consequences of the worst mission of his career. The human had escaped through their ventilation system, stolen an escape pod, and successfully returned to his planet without any permanent harm, and the footage of his escape had already been transmitted to the Federation Council. Thelvax stood before the Council 3 weeks later, his crest flat against his skull, in a posture of complete submission as he delivered his report. "Honored members of the Council," he began, "I must recommend that the planet designated Sol 3, known locally as Earth, be immediately reclassified from primitive harmless to extreme caution." Murmurs rippled through the assembled representatives of dozens of species, and the council chairman leaned forward with interest. "Explain your reasoning, Commander," the chairman requested. Thelvax pulled up images and data on the main display, showing the council members everything his crew had learned about humans in general, and Australians in particular. He described the venomous creatures and deadly predators that shared the Australian continent with its human inhabitants, and he explained how the humans had not fled from these dangers, but had instead learned to live alongside them. He talked about box jellyfish, and funnel web spiders, and saltwater crocodiles, and he described a human grandmother who had fought a venomous snake with a garden tool. The humans have evolved in an environment of constant danger, Felvax concluded, and as a result, they have developed a psychological profile that makes them unpredictable and extremely difficult to contain. He then showed footage of Danny escaping through the ventilation system, crawling through spaces that should have been impassable, and ignoring hazards that would have stopped any other species. This single human escaped our custody using nothing but his own ingenuity and an apparent complete lack of self-preservation instinct. The commander explained. He showed no fear during his entire captivity, and treated his situation as a minor inconvenience rather than a crisis. The council members watched in silence as Danny dropped from the ceiling grate and cheerfully greeted the terrified technician before commandeering an escape pod. Our psychological models cannot account for creatures like this, Felvax admitted, and I believe that any attempt to study or interact with humans will produce similarly unpredictable results. The council debated for several hours before reaching a unanimous decision, and the planet Earth was officially designated a no-contact zone, effective immediately. Warning beacons were placed around the solar system, advising all Federation vessels to avoid the third planet. And the records of the Ascending Dawn's mission were classified at the highest levels. The Veltharis spread the word among their allies and trading partners. Humans were not to be approached, studied, or provoked under any circumstances. Rumors began to circulate throughout the galaxy about the strange primates of Sol 3, who lived alongside deadly creatures and showed no fear of death. And the legend only grew as time passed. Back on Earth, Danny finished his semester at Greenfield State with decent grades, despite missing several days of class, and he eventually returned to Australia after completing his exchange program. He got a job as an engineer at a mining company, and settled down in a small town not far from where he had grown up. And he lived a quiet, normal life that included occasional surfing trips and Sunday barbecues with his mates. One evening, he was sitting at the local pub with his friend Kevin, drinking beer and watching the footy on the television above the bar. "You know, I never did tell you what really happened that time I went missing in America," Danny said during a commercial break. "Got picked up by some aliens," Danny explained. "Reptile blokes about 7 feet tall, with scales that changed color. Kept me on their ship for 3 days before I escaped." Kevin laughed and shook his head, assuming his friend was having him on. "What did you do to them?" Kevin asked, playing along. "Just told them about home, mostly," Danny said with a shrug. "Think I might have traumatized them a bit with all the spider and snake talk." Kevin signaled for another round of drinks and clapped his friend on the back. "Classic Danny," he said with a grin. And somewhere far away in the vast darkness between stars, the story of the Australian human who could not be frightened was passed from species to species as a warning and a wonder. They spoke of a planet where everything was deadly, and the inhabitants simply did not care. And they spoke of a young man he had escaped an advanced alien vessel, using nothing but courage and the stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, but the beings who traveled between the stars had learned to give one small blue planet a very wide berth. Earth remained untouched and uncontacted, protected not by weapons or shields, but by the simple fact that its inhabitants were far too strange and far too fearless for anyone else to handle. And that was exactly how Danny and the rest of humanity liked it.